how we came up with the victory plan is we just said, okay, what should we actually do as a country? Not what is politically possible or popular. We're actually saying, what should we do? And I think taking that kind of approach allows you to see how incredibly artificially constrained our politics are by common sense or like the media or pundits telling you what's possible and what's impossible when we just need to think so much bigger than that.
Hello, and welcome to the 275th edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmons, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I will be your host today. Climate activism takes many forms, knocking on doors, writing to elected officials, marching in the streets, and much more. In recent years, we've seen the rapid rise of movements around the world engaged in what many describe as disruptive, nonviolent climate action. Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Climate Defiance here in the United States, and many others. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome back someone who plays a pivotal role in this ecosystem, Margaret Klein Salamon, the executive director of the Climate Emergency Fund. The fund is a philanthropic organization that supports individuals and groups committed to disruptive, nonviolent climate activism. Since 2019, the fund has helped train more than 100,000 climate activists and supported, according to the website, 163 organizations worldwide. This is a remarkable footprint, and today we'll explore the theory of change that guides your grant making and what that's all about. Margaret, for those of you who missed our program last week, brings a unique background to this work. She's a clinical psychologist, the author of Facing the Climate Emergency, and the co-founder of the Climate Mobilization, one of the very first organizations to declare clearly and courageously that we were in a climate emergency nearly a decade ago. And her work directly led to my involvement, for better or worse, in the climate movement. Margaret, we're thrilled to have you back for a second conversation. And joining us, as always, are two regular panelists, Dr. Peter Carter, retired medical doctor from British Columbia and longtime IPCC expert reviewer, and Paul Beckwith, climate system scientist from Ottawa. And if you find value in our work, please like this program, subscribe to our channel, share it widely, leave your comments, and visit climateemergencyforum.org for articles, updates, and ways to support our efforts. Margaret, we deeply appreciate your time and leadership. And so let's jump right in. As I mentioned, you lead an organization, a unique one, I think it's fair to say, that focuses its grants specifically on groups engaged in what I understand is disruptive nonviolent climate action. Why this focus? What's the theory behind this? I'm eager to find out, and I'm sure all of our viewers are as well.
Thank you so much. Social movements have their own ecosystems with many different groups and contributors employing different theories of change. So, in some movement scholars who I really like from the Eine Institute talk about the inside game, lobbying and court cases and think tanks, community organizing, which is like unions and churches and organizing that takes place there, and personal change, which would include things like veganism, biking, conversations about climate emotions, and building alternatives. So solar farms and community energy, different, communal living. Okay, so all these different theories of change and protest, which really to be effective needs to be somewhat disruptive of business as usual. So all of these elements are very important. The fact that Climate Emergency Fund only supports groups that take part in disruption does not mean that we think it's the only thing that matters. Rather, we think it's critical and we see that it's virtually unfunded. All of the elements of the climate movement are underfunded. All of them. They all need billionaires to come in, or, they all need much more investment from philanthropy. But groups like you mentioned Climate Defiance, Extinction Rebellion, groups that want to make protest, nonviolent, civil disobedience, disruption, anything like that, a core part of their strategy, find it almost virtually impossible to get funding, especially in their early stages, which is when the funding is most critical and can go, a small amount of funding can go such a long way. So, Climate Emergency Fund exists to fill that gap. And as a non endowed fund or a grant making intermediary, we raise all of the money that we then give away. So I actually have some fair amount of experience about talking about climate with some very wealthy people and philanthropists, though I think I get the opportunity to talk to some of the just absolutely most enlightened and engaged members of the ultra wealthy that are out there. So yeah, so we raise money for and then make grants to disruptive climate activist campaigns.
Is it fair to say that at least at this point, your organization is fairly unique in the climate ecosystem?
Like I said, these groups can barely get any institutional funding. And when they do, it tends to be from a group like, let's say, for example, Ben and Jerry's Foundation, which supports broader range of groups, but including some groups that engage in protest. But yes, we are unique as being one that has kind of carved out that niche as our
Right.
area.
Well, if I could put you on the spot for one question before I turn it over to Peter, and that is, can you sort of go through your mental Rolodex and pick out maybe one of the grantees and give us a brief vignette of how you supported them and what they did as an example?
Sure, yeah. Climate Defiance, I think, is a great example because we provided them seed funding, meaning we actually supported Climate Defiance before it existed when Michael Greenberg and some of his close associates were doing one-off deployments of activists to the Line 3 pipeline protest and then down to Joe Manchin's coal plant in West Virginia. So we had funded some of those, and when he said that they would like to do a more permanent organization, we said, okay, great. So we provided like 90% of their funding in their first year, but then they were able to start up their own pretty successful fundraising. I mean, it's still, again, not nearly enough, but so then we scaled back our support to like 50% in their second year. I don't know what percent in their third year, but below that. So in that way, this is like really our kind of, I think, highest and best use as a fund is to be able to identify organizations so early, really before basically anyone could, and help them when it's so critical financial injection. Because we're not talking about a lot of money. I mean, I think our grant to them was, I think it was less than $200,000 in their first year, maybe as much as 250. So that seed funding, knowing activists in the space, knowing what's going on, building relationships with leaders, and being able to fund projects as they kind of bubble up is, I think, where we have just a great deal of value to offer to our funders. Because if you think about it, if you, let's say you are a billionaire or just a wealthy philanthropist who wants to, or even a middle class philanthropist that is willing to let a fair portion of your finances go, that wants to make a difference in climate or that wants to support these types of groups, it would literally be impossible, again, to fund groups at this very early stage. Like, how would you even meet them? How would you know about them? How would they know about you to pitch you? I do want to just mention, if it's okay, that when I was in the very early stages of the climate mobilization and trying to raise funds, we were not a disruptive group in the way of this kind of protest, but we were a brand new startup, kind of a group that there was no category for, a group that was like doing things differently. Anyway, that Peter Carter was one of our very first seed funders. I mean, and it was hugely important to a small group that's just getting started. that
Well,
relies on volunteers, climate mobilization did.
well, that's a perfect segue for Peter Carter to take the floor and take a bow for your early support, which directly or indirectly helped support the work that I did for climate mobilization here. And the quick thing I just want to say for those who are watching this who have some ideas for disruptive climate action, and I think it's fair to say you fund groups all over the planet, not just in the United States. Take a look at the website. We'll post it. And if you think there might be a match, please get in touch. I'm sure that the fund would be happy to hear from you. With that, Peter, welcome, and the floor is yours.
I was remembering, Margaret, you and partners formed the Climate Mobilization 2014, 2015. So you put together a what was called a Climate Mobilization Victory Plan. I think that was just a couple of years later. Now I remember going through that, with my scientific tooth comb, basically, and it was absolutely superb. It had everything, right? And I should also mention that maybe one of the things that people might have questioned at that time, 10 years ago, was that the plan said that the United States could eliminate net greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. And that, I'm afraid, slips me back into science because the IPCC has stated categorically that global emissions had to go into decline by 2025 at the very latest for 1.5, but also for 2 degrees C. So it's probably good to remind ourselves how more than on top of things you were. And people need a plan, right? That's one thing that I read about psychology. If we've got bad news or something, okay, people can handle it, but they need a plan. So I guess that's still out there. So I'll remind you of a quote that you made recently that picks me up from last week's discussion. If humanity's two choices are to transform or collapse, the only rational moral choice is to immerse yourself in the struggle to protect all life. Now, we very, very seldom hear, that the thing to do is to be protecting all of life and to grieve, as you focus on, which you've already mentioned last week, the loss of that life. So, can you talk a little bit more about certainly your personal vision that it's not just humanity, it's not just all of humanity, it's all of life that we're looking at?
Yeah, I guess to me, I mean, I think these are very moral and spiritual kind of concepts and conversations. But to me, I think there's two just incredible miracles of the world, or maybe three. One is that anything exists at all. Two is humanity. I think we're incredible. And the third is biodiversity. I mean, just all of life, all of the ecosystems. It's what other proof of God or creation. I mean, or maybe it's not. Maybe like it's some kind of randomness, but it's the most precious thing, or like these things basically weighted equally to me, humanity and all other life. And the good news is you can't have one without the other, or you wait, no, you can't have humanity without the rest of life. The rest of life, I guess, could probably do without humanity, but I would like to see both thrive. I also want to say, shout out the late Australian climate leader Philip Sutton, who was totally core thought leader around climate emergency, and climate emergency declarations and climate mobilization. And he had a personal saying of all people, for all life, all people, all generations, something like that. But that I find like, what greater purpose could there be? And then finally, just on the victory plan, I want to say thank you for recognizing that, and for Ezra Silk, the author of the victory plan. How we came up with that document, that plan, that approach is we just said, okay, what should we actually do as a country? Not what is politically possible or popular or anything like that. We're not constraining ourselves with that. We're actually saying, if we, what should we do? And I think taking that kind of approach allows you to see how incredibly artificially constrained our politics are by common sense, or like the media or pundits telling you what's possible and what's impossible when we just need to think so much bigger than that. And then finally, I just want to direct you to Mission for America, a project by New Consensus, which I kind of think of as the next phase of the Victory Plan, though they are certainly also different. Mission for America is more in depth in terms of their build out of proposals.
Thank you, Margaret. I'll second what Peter said and what you said about the victory plan. And I haven't come across anything that's more realistic in terms of not just what should we do, what do we need to do? And
Yeah.
if you combine the victory plan with an expression, more than an expression, a perspective that Sir David King, who we had on our program recently, has said, the eminent British climate scientist and diplomat. He said a few years ago, he said, what we do in the next 5 years will determine the course of life for the next 10,000. And essentially, the victory plan was responding to something like that. We need to do this, we need to do it now. And it's a binary. You can't negotiate with physics, you can't negotiate with the atmosphere, unlike the prevailing wisdom, which is it's more important to focus on the latest scandal or whatever. Anyway, I want to turn it over to Paul. Paul, floor is yours.
Thanks, Margaret. Of these activism groups, you're obviously dealing with many of them. Are you seeing a switch in what their objective is? What I'm saying is, a few years ago, before the crisis accelerated, before the losses from extreme weather events accelerated and the rest of it, people were trying to, activists were trying to sort of preserve the climate so we could still grow the economy and still grow the population and provide for everybody, sort of a utopian type of view. And my guess is that many of the activist groups now are saying, okay, we're going to have a societal collapse. We've gone too far. We're way in passing all these limits of what the earth can handle. And so what do we do to come out the other end successfully? So in other words, they're not activists trying to preserve the status quo. They're activists trying to preserve life on this planet, human life and animal life, after we have a massive collapse of society and chaos, climate change driven or other, or driven for other reasons. I mean, do you see a sort of a switch in some of the objectives of these groups from the former to the latter? Because we can talk about hope and we can talk about reality, and
Yeah,
often they're quite different.
yeah, I think that most of the groups that we support are more focused on fighting the fossil fuel industry and fighting wealth inequality and trying to develop potentially new governance structures is something that a lot of groups are interested in, like around citizens assemblies, that rather than I mean the kind of planning for collapse thing that you're talking about, not to say that that would be bad, but I don't think I'm really seeing that. I'm seeing, for example, a rising campaign around pushing back on data centers, right? Trying to stop data center construction, or at the minimum, make sure it's powered by renewables. So I guess you could say groups maybe taking on, but I think this has kind of always been the case, but taking on like one chunk of the fight, fighting
Right.
a pipeline or fighting a data center or fighting, I mean, group we support in the UK is doing citizens arrests of fossil fuel executives and water executives, privatized water executives, and Climate Defiance giving hell to politicians. I mean, it is true that at the national level in the United States, there's not hope for climate policy right now. The most we could hope for is to slow the destruction that the Trump administration is unleashing on science and on progress. But I think most groups might not have that level of kind of future orientation or like
Right.
metaphysical kind of
Right. It's more of
understanding.
a local, what can we do in our region or
Or in our country, what
in
kind
our
of like,
country?
getting policies passed about restoring wetlands or protecting ecosystems. So I guess fighting the fossil fuel industry is, I would say, the summary of what the climate movement is doing right now. But also, I mean, of course, should also say the climate movement overall, especially in the United States, is very weak right now. The Trump administration and other things, but mainly like COVID was a huge hit to the climate movement. But the Trump administration in particular is, there's paramilitary groups snatching children and people off the streets. So there's really quite a significant amount of grassroots resistance to that, particularly, which I mean, I fully support. But I also think that it is really important that we cannot forget about the climate. It remains the most important thing that's ever happened.
Yes, but I think acknowledgement that there's some other wild cards that can come in, for example, another pandemic, that's a lot easier for people to understand after we went through the last one. Mutations, of different viruses and things are still, a huge threat to society, passing from animals to humans, et cetera. I mean, the risk has gotten higher, and I would think there'd be more recognition among people in society that, we can worry about climate, but if something like this comes up and hits us, we also have to think of that. And of course, people are becoming more aware of plastics in the human body and possible effects on dementia, etc. So there's lots of, there's a myriad, long list of threats. So you have risk assessment, I think, as being an important factor of this movement. Like, what are the risks of climate relative to some other risks? And the World Economic Forum, of course, has their own reports on risk assessment that vary each year. They put it out just before Davos each year. Climate was well up high on many of the lists that they generated last year, and this year it's dropped off because of some of the other effects that are going on. So anyway, yeah, it's just something to think of that we need to be aware of other things as well, and yeah, although
Uh,
the priority is climate risks. Also, I think the movement needs to really put out that many of the things that are happening today, climate is root cause
Yes.
behind it, but it's never mentioned by mainstream media. So, for example, the effect of climate destroying crops or specific crops around the world causing huge inflationary prices on some basic foodstuffs. Like I'm thinking coffee, like anything that we use in our society could be at risk of higher prices through to scarcity from climate change. So I think if the movement can get more traction on mainstream media, I think that would be very important. So I don't know, there must be some groups that you're funding that are really trying to get more mainstream access to the public via media because media is becoming more tightly controlled. So thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Paul.
Margaret, I wanted to ask you a question. Some of us, including Paul, are focused on the fact that what I call ERA, emission reductions alone, is no longer sufficient. And I know I was at the UN with you when you were on a panel on climate restoration years ago, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time on, and Paul and others. Have you found any of the activist groups that you fund are looking beyond emissions to carbon removal? Or cooling, solar radiation management. Our experience is that most activist groups are extremely hostile rather than recognizing the complementary role that they can play. And I'm just curious whether you've seen any shift in that.
I think that that's basically true, but I think kind of as I was saying to Paul, I don't know. I mean, I would say most groups that we support don't even have a position on that. I think something that was pretty unique about climate mobilization and that I feel like some of these questions are really emphasizing for me is that we did take on this work of trying to have like a full platform, and for on climate, which is extremely hard to do because it has so many factors. So right, so does an activist group support veganism, for example? Do they support nuclear? Do they support
Mhm.
cooling? Do they support drawdown? Most of them, I don't think go into all that, and which I don't think necessarily most groups need to, right? If their focus is going to be, yeah, to stop the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, then I think that's a very legitimate focus. I do think, obviously, that there's room and even a need for some groups like because what climate mobilization I think was unique about it is that we were like both a think tank and a kind of activist advocate community organizing group. Most groups don't have a think tank attached to them. you
Yeah,
know?
and you were so remarkably tiny, and you were able to do both so successfully. That was pretty remarkable. I want to thank you, and we've come to the end of time for today. First, I want to say the victory plan that we talked about before, I've noticed is on the website of the Climate Emergency Fund. So please go there and find it and read it. It's still relevant today, more relevant than ever. And secondly, I want to give you the last word, Margaret. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our viewers about climate psychology or climate activism that you could leave with them?
On the psychological side, I think talking with other people about your feelings about the climate emergency is just really, really, really important. You can just ask your friends or your family or your neighbors or whatever, but you can ask people in your life, how do you feel about the climate? How is that affecting you in your heart and mind and, day to day? And I mean, honestly, it shocks me as a psychologist, but people will say, huh, no one ever asked me that before. I never thought about that before. And it's like, what? You never, come on. Even people in the climate space will say things like that because it's so intellectualized. So, yes, how do you feel about the climate emergency? That's what I want to say as a climate psychologist. And then, just as the executive director of Climate Emergency Fund, I want to say please consider funding activists. Please consider becoming an activist and thinking about what you can do. And I get really in depth with this in facing the climate emergency. But something that you can do today is make a donation, and it makes a really big difference. These groups are powered by volunteers, volunteer activists, volunteer organizers. But to have people be able to work full time, most people cannot be volunteers for that. They need some money, but they're not making like, a good salary. They're doing it out of passion and moral duty, and your money will go a really long way in supporting them, really supercharging their efforts. So that's my pitch for supporting Climate Emergency Fund, or you can fund the activist groups individually.
Thank you. I went to the fundraiser that I think you were there 2 years ago in Washington for Climate Defiance, and rarely have I seen an organization accomplish so much with so little funding. And I
Exactly.
think it's a good model, as we talked about before. I want to thank you, Margaret, so much, both this week and last week, for being with us. One thing that just struck me, maybe the most obvious thing imaginable, both of our organizations have the initials CEF, right? And from one CEF to the other, we wish you the best. We hope you'll stay in touch with us. We're all on the same side, and we have the same goal, ultimately, to restore a safe and healthy climate. So thank you today, Margaret. Good luck to you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Paul. And we encourage those of you who are viewing to leave your comments, leave your suggestions, and to take Margaret's advice to heart. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.